Thanks, Holly. The U.S. does not negotiate with terror groups, and this swap could set a precedent for other hostage negotiations with the terror group. Now, State Department correspondent Margaret Brennan joins us from Washington, and senior national security analyst Juan Zarate joins us on the phone. Margaret, let's start with you. This is potentially dangerous new territory. What kind of reaction are we getting from the State Department? Can we expect from the State Department?
Nothing public, really. They're going to be very careful with this one. But privately, diplomats say, listen, this is an uncomfortable position to be put in. Jordan is a hugely important ally when it comes to the fight against ISIS and extremism. But it's also uncomfortable for the U.S. because, once again, this is one of those special cases where the U.S. does have to be a little understanding, as one diplomat said to me, because it involves a member of their military. And remember, it was just this summer that the United States, though it says it does not negotiate with terrorists, did agree to swap 5 Taliban footmen, soldiers that they had in captivity for 1 U.S. Army Sergeant, Bo Bergdahl. That was negotiated through a third party, so the U.S. can still state it doesn't negotiate with terrorists, but they know that there's a lot of scrutiny right now, and there are some exceptions made. Israel, just a few years ago, swapped 1,000 prisoners in a deal with Hamas for 1 Israeli soldier. So this is not the first time that this kind of deal has been made, but when it comes to ISIS, you're right. I mean, this is really going to be interesting to see how it plays out. So far, we know that suicide bomber, or failed suicide bomber, Sajid al-Rashid, has not been handed over yet.
Let me bring in Juan Zarate. Juan, what are sort of the broader implications of this exchange? Because as Margaret points out, the United States has exchanged 5 Taliban prisoners for Army Sergeant Bo Bergdahl. The state of Israel has exchanged, as Margaret rightly pointed out, thousands of prisoners, sometimes for just 1 Israeli citizen being held. Are we looking at ISIS acting more as a state as opposed to a terror group? In other words, states do negotiate the return of prisoners amongst each other.
Well, I don't think it necessarily suggests that they're acting more as a state as a result of asking for prisoner exchange. You've had terrorist groups in the past that have certainly tried to exchange their prisoners, their operatives, for other actors, certainly Hamas, Hezbollah, even Al-Qaeda. Al-Qaeda has frequently asked for the release of Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, the blind sheikh, even Afia Siddiqui. 2 or 3 of those are in federal prison in the U.S. And so it's not new that you would have terrorist groups asking for an exchange. I think there are 2 dimensions to this that are interesting and dangerous. One, as Margaret pointed out, this sense that the idea of offering concessions, regardless of how you package it, and regardless of whether or not you're talking about a soldier or not, concessions to a terrorist organization by giving them key prisoners that they want in exchange really does add momentum to not just the hostage for ransom trade, but also the legitimacy of those kinds of swaps, which I think the U.S. has tried to avoid in the past. And I think that's part of the danger of what's happening now. The other dimension is these terrorist groups realize that they can take these hostages and really provoke crises both within Jordan, between allies like the Japanese and the Jordanians, and can use the threat of killing prisoners and the difficulty of a prisoner swap to really inject strategic confusion and tension between key allies in a coalition fighting against them. And so I think the real danger here is not only the issue of concessions to terrorists and the swaps, but also the fact that we are signaling perhaps to terrorist groups that they can inject a strategic dimension and element into the equation, into a coalition that's trying to fight and battle them.
Certainly strengthens their position. Margaret, we have to bring you in and ask you how, you mentioned that Jordan is such a key ally for the United States. Is this going to fracture our relationship? Is this going to impact our relationship with Jordan?
Well, broadly speaking, there have been concerns about fractures in the coalition against ISIS because there are so many different opinions, particularly strong ones about how to deal with ISIS's stronghold in Syria, and criticism that the U.S.-led coalition isn't really fully addressing that. But you got to think about Jordan here as being in a really unique position. They have a proximity to this fight that really is hard for anyone else to imagine. They have borders that are being flooded with refugees coming from Iraq, coming from Syria. They are very concerned about who's coming across that border. They're very concerned about extremists crossing into their territory. They are really on the front line. So they are part of the military campaign here alongside the U.S., but when it comes to domestic politics, King Abdullah, the ruler of that country, is under a tremendous amount of pressure. And this case with this pilot has really heightened a lot of scrutiny and people asking tough questions about whether the U.S.-led campaign is focused in the right way and whether Jordan should be allowing and going along with some of the U.S. decisions here when perhaps, that it's not necessarily in their own best interest.
Juan, let me just ask you before we wrap up here. Given that some European nations besides the United Kingdom have in the past negotiated with some terrorist organizations to return their citizens safely, doesn't that make it more dangerous in some way for Americans in the sense that terrorists know that America and the UK does not pay, so that they're more at risk to be killed by a terrorist organization as opposed to being swapped?
Well, that's right. Certainly European countries, especially continental European countries, have paid for their return of hostages. It's in part why the kidnap for ransom trade now fuels a lot of terrorist groups like Al-Qaeda in the Islamic Maghreb in North Africa. And so certainly they have created a precedent where there is profit around taking European hostages. And it does differentiate to a certain extent the American and British hostages, which in some ways creates a differentiation of the hostage population and does put Americans and British hostages at risk. And what we've seen certainly from ISIS is the fact that they're willing to not only use these hostages for propaganda value, perhaps for some profit, but also then to terrorize and to prompt reactions. Especially you've seen this with the gruesome beheadings of Americans. And so hostages here have become pawns in the strategic game that ISIS is playing, and you see it playing out now in the context of the swap deal that may be unfolding with Jordan.
All right, Juan Zarate, Senior National Security Analyst, and Margaret Brennan, our State Department correspondent. We thank you both.